Hello, lovelies, and welcome back. I've got an amazing episode for you today about chronic fatigue, and we have a special guest. Her name is Dr. Vanessa, and she is a naturopathic physician who has been an amazing, incredible support to me through my chronic illness. Naturopathic physicians diagnose and treat health problems with nutritional and lifestyle advice, herbal medicines, and natural therapies. Dr. Vanessa's specific specialties include hormone imbalances, chronic conditions, mental health concerns and addictions, autoimmune disease, cancer, and biohacking. Because we have so much amazing information to share with you, and because maintaining focus can be pretty difficult when you have chronic fatigue, we're going to split this information across multiple episodes. As always, the content warning for this episode includes my foul mouth, and today I'm joined in my foul language with Dr. Vanessa. My mom always warned me that if you have friends with bad habits, you're likely to fall into those habits as well. Well, sorry, Mom. I bet you didn't think I was going to be the one corrupting others. Hello, lovelies, and welcome back to another episode of Not a Floating Head. We're doing something a bit different today. We are trying video along with our audio. So if you are the type of person that wants to watch a podcast on YouTube or listen to the podcast through YouTube, we will have some video up of my interview with Dr. Vanessa, a very special guest whom I'm super excited to introduce today. Today's topic is chronic fatigue, inflammation, and mental health. So the title of our podcast is Why the Fuck Am I So Tired When I'm Doing Everything Right? So we're going to answer some of those questions for you today.
Hey, Dr. Robyn, I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. So my name is Dr. Vanessa Ingraham. I'm a naturopathic medical doctor. And so that's a little bit different from, our traditional naturopaths that we have here in New Zealand. So basically our training in North America is we're much more like integrative GPs or primary care physicians in that, we're able to diagnose, prescribe medications in certain states. And we tend to do a lot with, high dose nutrient therapy, sometimes intravenous. And so it could be a little bit different than what we're used to here. But more importantly, just like, a lot of traditionally minded naturopaths, we're looking at our clients and our patients as a whole person. We're trying to get to the root cause of symptoms, and we really embrace the whole idea of, doctor as teacher. So we're all about education. And, that's one of the reasons why I'm so thrilled to be here today. I love teaching and I love sharing what I know. So thank you so much, Robyn.
Awesome. And for you guys, Dr. V is an amazing teacher. I've learned so much from her. And two things I want to say real quick is one, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Vanessa and I, you're from the Bahamas or you're from the US? I can't remember which one.
Originally from the Bahamas.
Yeah, so is originally from the Bahamas. I'm originally from the US, but we're both in New Zealand currently. So for those of you that are listening to the podcast, when she says over here, she's referring to New Zealand. And also, I completely forgot to introduce how I met Dr. Vanessa. And so I'll just take a moment to do that. I will also share my story in a few minutes when we kind of get into a little bit more about chronic fatigue. But basically, I joined an amazing CrossFit gym in New Zealand and was sharing with one of my favorite coaches ever, Emma, about my own kind of medical issues and what I had been going through and chronic fatigue and exhaustion and basically my chronic illness journey. And I had seen naturopath after naturopath after naturopath, which again, I'll get into in my story. And none of them were very helpful. And so when I was talking to Emma, she said, I got the person for you. Dr. Vanessa's amazing. She treats most of us here at CrossFit. And boy, was she right. So that is how I got introduced to Dr. Vanessa. And she has dramatically helped me. And not only me, but we've shared some patients and had some wonderful successes with that. So I'm just thrilled to have her here today. Without further ado, do you want us to get into what chronic fatigue is? Would you like me to kind of start there?
Absolutely. And I think it's so important to just acknowledge that, this idea of chronic fatigue and fatigue syndromes in general are an actual medical condition. A lot of the podcast obviously is called Not a Floating Head. And, it's so heartbreaking for me, to have patients who come in who have been to their GPs, who have been to other practitioners, who basically just looked at, traditional or standard blood work and said everything's fine. these people are suffering, and, this idea of chronic fatigue is a real thing. So let's definitely get into that.
Yes, absolutely. First, for those of you who may not know, chronic fatigue, also known as, and give me a second to pronounce this, myalgic encephalomyelitis, is a disease characterized as a neurological illness. The term myalgic encephalomyelitis means pain in the muscles and inflammation in the brain and spinal cord.
Yeah, no, and I just think it's really important to reiterate the point that, while a lot of, general practitioners may not be that familiar with this condition, it is really important to understand it's not just in your head, it's deeply entrenched in your body, underlined by your immune system function, your hormones, your exposures, and, to take it really seriously.
Yes, you are not a floating head. All right. Also, I just want to throw in kind of what some of the symptoms may be. And forgive me, guys, if you're watching on video, I am just kind of making sure that I read my notes on this because I don't want to miss any potential symptoms. So basically, because chronic fatigue syndrome is a very complex multi-system chronic illness, many other symptoms will occur and must be present for diagnosis. These include, but aren't necessarily limited to, problems with thinking, concentrating, memory loss, vision, clumsiness, muscle twitching or tingling, sometimes called neurocognitive problems, disrupted sleep, pain or aches in the muscles, joints, or head, a drop in blood pressure, feeling dizzy or pale, palpitations, increased heart rate or shortness of breath with exertion or on standing. So let me say that again. Increased heart rate or shortness of breath with activity exertion or upon standing. Allergies or sensitivities to light, smells, touch, sound, foods, chemicals, and medications. Gastrointestinal changes such as nausea, bloating, constipation, diarrhea, which a lot of times people will think is IBS. Urinary problems, sore throat, tender lymph nodes, and a flu-like feeling, marked weight change, extreme loss or gain, either one, it's different depending on the person, inability to cope with temperature changes. A person's symptoms will fluctuate or can fluctuate over short periods of time, even from hour to hour. So as you can see, this is so much more than just fatigue.
I just think it's really important for people to remember too. Often, we don't put a lot of symptoms together. We'll have one thing, maybe a little, weird feeling in our fingers or lightheadedness when we stand up, and then some gut changes. And it's really important to kind of think of our body as a whole and not kind of try to diagnose ourselves based on one or two symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that is important. And also what's really important that we want you to know today is that the CDC estimates that 1 million people in the US have chronic fatigue syndrome, and as many as 17 to 24 million people worldwide suffer with chronic fatigue syndrome. And I do mean suffer. Additionally, a recent UK Biobank study places the worldwide estimate at 30 million people. 30 million people, guys. So chances are that you or someone you know may be experiencing and trying to cope with chronic fatigue.
And I think also it's also important to remember that, symptoms, they don't always end up, or they don't always start kind of severely. And so it's really important to take things seriously, at the onset. So, if you have a practitioner or a doctor who's not kind of looking into or investigating some, random seeming symptoms that you're having and not taking them seriously, it is important to kind of keep pressing and kind of keep investigations open.
Absolutely. And hopefully as Vanessa goes more into this stuff, we will give you guys ideas of actually how to track these symptoms and what will help you when you go to the doctor to discuss these symptoms. Also, lovelies, within those symptoms, there is going to be a variation in the, Vanessa, how did you say it a second ago that was so good? Severity. The severity of your symptoms. Some symptoms may be more severe, some symptoms may be less severe, and you can't compare your symptoms to symptoms that someone else may be having or experiencing. Also, within chronic fatigue syndrome, there are many subtypes within this spectrum, which means that treatment, like therapy, is not a one-size-fits-all approach. applying one type of treatment for one subtype can be very damaging to another subtype, which I think Vanessa will probably get into more as she's actually talking about what some of the things that you need to look at and consider if you think that you may have chronic fatigue syndrome. Would you say that's accurate, Vanessa?
Absolutely. And I think, the term chronic fatigue syndrome, it really describes kind of the result of kind of what's going on. And everyone's causes of why they got to that point are going to be a little bit different. Some people's may be more underlined by, toxic exposure, mold in the environment, or some kind of inflammatory syndrome, versus someone else that could be more driven by something like kind of stress and hormone imbalance. So in that sense, treatment could be very different because we're working on the underlying causes.
So let me take a second and ask Vanessa, what are some of the things that we think or know can cause chronic fatigue syndrome?
Yeah, so chronic fatigue syndrome, is underlined by this idea of inflammation, or our immune system just being a little bit overactive, or not responding appropriately. And a lot of the things that kind of drive that immune system dysregulation or imbalance are things like latent infections, things like Epstein-Barr, CMV, herpes type infections. These things tend to live in our body, and if they're not cleared completely, they can kind of be in silent mode and kind of reactivate, causing the immune system to be quite confused. Other things that I see a lot in my practice are things like, different environmental toxicant exposures. So things like, pesticide residues, things on food, things in our personal care products and cleaning products. A lot of us are exquisitely sensitive to some of these chemicals, which actually disrupt our cells' ability to make energy. There's also another big one is, heavy metal exposure. So things like cadmium, lead, mercury, all of these things kind of mess up the way our cells produce energy again. In New Zealand, one that I see quite a bit is, mold exposure. So about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 people will be just genetically a little bit or very sensitive to mold in the environment. And for these people, when they're breathing in mold or they're living in moldy environments, their immune system just gets switched on. And that just drives this chronic low-grade inflammation, like a slow burning fire that just kind of interferes with our body's ability to make energy.
Yeah.
Of course, other obvious things we always need to consider are things like nutritional deficiencies, being low in certain vitamins and minerals that are needed for energy production. And of course, tying onto that, our gastrointestinal health. So a lot of us have heard of, this idea of the gut microbiome, but, what a lot of us don't realize is we have about 10 times as many bacterial cells that are us than we have human cells. So, the balance of bacteria in our gut actually interact with our immune system. And when that's a little bit out of whack from our diet, from our stress levels, that can also spur on this idea of chronic low-grade inflammation that can be underlying chronic fatigue syndrome. Of course, honorable mentions, again, we have our hormone balance. For women, obviously, we have, our sex hormones, but another big one is our thyroid function. Our thyroid has a lot to do with our metabolic rate. And then we have our stress hormones or our adrenal hormones, and these interact with our thyroid hormones as well as our sex hormones. And altogether, if that like hormonal symphony isn't, if everyone's not playing the right tune, that can also upset the immune system and kind of lead or, exacerbate chronic fatigue syndrome. So those are kind of the main ones, I think.
Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah.
And just really quickly, Robyn, one resource I really want to just mention to everyone that you can, everyone has access to is, so when we're exposed to, things like mold in our environment or certain heavy metals and things like that, it can cause this idea of neuroinflammation or inflammation in the brain. Mm-hmm. And, from anatomy, we know that the eyes are really just projections of the brain. And so basically we can get swelling in the brain and then swelling in the optic nerve. And there's a really interesting way we can test this. It's called testing visual contrast sensitivity. And this is basically an online vision test you can do. And it's not diagnostic, but it is a nice screen to tell you if you should kind of pursue this line of thinking. Okay. And so if you go to a website called www.vcstest.com. So it's visual contrast sensitivity.
Got it. So sorry, say that again because I interrupted you.
Very fast. Sorry, I get very excited. That's VCS test, a visual contrast sensitivity test.com. You can log in, you can do this online test. It can basically tell you if, there's a, if based on, the people who've done the test, if you're likely to have this little bit of inflammation that's showing up that's messing up your ability to discern visual contrast, and if you should pursue this idea neuroinflammation due to mold or metals a little bit further.
And is that's specific to metals and mold, or is that other things that could be causing that neuroinflammation as well?
No, it's not specific, but it is a test for just basically CNS inflammation or inflammation in this central nervous system.
So it would be so basically what I'm hearing you say is that could be a potential. Is it free? Is it something you can do free, or is it relatively expensive?
I think it's $14. You have to donate to the foundation. It's a research foundation.
So
and again, it's not diagnostic, it's just a screen.
Yeah. So $14 for kind of a precursor leading up to a potential diagnosis. But that's pretty freaking affordable. $14 is pretty decent. Right. And if do you think that a GP or a primary care doctor is going to actually look at that? Or do you think they're going to think that you went off the rails and did Dr. Google and they're going to throw that out the window?
Most general practitioners, unless they're kind of familiar with kind of Lyme disease, mold illness, and kind of chronic fatigue, they may not be familiar with it. But it's very research backed. It's based on the work by Dr. Schumacher, who's one of the experts in mold.
Okay.
And you go to the website, there's a lot of information there. And like I said, it's a good screen, not diagnostic, but when we get into like actually testing for, urinary mycotoxins or mold exposure in the urine or heavy metals, that can be up in the, $500, $600, $700 range. So
Right.
And if someone's consistently testing negative on that test, it would make me as a physician much less likely to do some of the expensive testing.
Yeah, I think that's really important, is that there are things that I say we, meaning you, can do with your patients before, possibly before you get to those real expensive tests that people may have to save up for, because obviously not everyone is privileged enough to be able to just, spend $700 on this testing. But if they've got the $14 and they see that they're not really within that range, if they're bringing this to you, then you would focus on other things rather than wasting money going down that line of thinking. So the $14 would actually be a really good investment in that sense.
Absolutely. And, we should never, base any kind of testing or diagnosis or anything on, one test. Right. It is, it's just gathering more information and then deciding kind of where to go with that information. So, looking at, maybe tests like the visual contrast sensitivity, looking at blood work, taking into account kind of symptoms and chronicity of symptoms. So when they're arising, if someone's always, if they're better when they go on vacation to Bali obviously there's many reasons, so it could be better. But, if they're always better when they're not at home, that would be another tip off. So, it's kind of taking everything in a holistic way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a really important point, is that we're looking, again, you like me treat people as a whole, not as a floating head. So you're taking all of the symptoms, the timing, kind of environment, stress levels, situational stressors, all of that, and looking at that picture. And I actually think this is a good place to say that this is a big difference between working with a doctor of naturopath versus a GP or a primary care physician, in that unfortunately a primary care or GP is limited to about 15 minutes per visit. And so they're not going to have time to get into all of that. And that's where we're not saying don't go to your GP. We're certainly not saying that. But by working with your GP as well as a doctor of naturopath, you can kind of get a better picture that then when you're ready to go to the GP, you've kind of done that work with the doctor of naturopath supporting you, that gives a more complete picture to the GP. I think that can be, for me, that's been really helpful, because obviously I see you and I have a GP. And that's one of the things that has been super helpful, is knowing exactly what I want to hone in on when I'm at the GP's office. So I'm not spending 15 minutes giving my whole background and then completely miss what's going on. Right.
Absolutely. And, I think, when it comes to, supporting someone's health, it really should be a team-based approach. Everyone kind of knows what their specialty is, and we're all helping each other and communicating, hopefully openly, to kind of best serve the person in front of us. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what we hope. That's what our goals are.
I know you might have been in this position, but, as a practitioner, as well as, a patient, nothing really fucking pisses me off more than when someone comes to me, they're obviously exhausted, they're struggling with their health, but they've been to kind of their GP or, their regular doctor, and they're told everything is fine. And So they've run maybe some basic or standard blood work and, sent them on their way. And I think, first of all, it's so important to acknowledge, the experience of the person, because as soon as we dismiss or, we're not listened to, that activates the stress response, and that kind of drives illness even further. The second thing to really take into account is this idea of standard blood work, and and just really understanding that what's normal, or what normal is not necessarily what healthy or optimal is. For instance, reference ranges are basically just the averages of everyone who's taken that blood test in that area. So
and it's also on that day and time, isn't it? On that day and within a certain time.
Exactly. So, I mean, the analogy I like to use is if you think of if you think of you or your body as a whole ocean, the blood work is like taking a cup of water or taking a glass and going down to the beach, at a random beach in New Zealand, taking a sample and saying, this cup of water is representative of the entire ocean, where, we're not taking into account, what time it was, what the tide was doing, what potential pollution there could have been in the ocean at that time because of what boats went past. And so you're the same. So, looking at blood work and saying it's normal, we need to take into the context of, everything else that's going on.
Yeah. So I just want to, because I think this is so important. And this was mind blowing for me when I learned this, because obviously anyone that has been feeling like shit that goes to the doctor and is told everything is normal. And then the psychology part of it comes in where you start thinking, am I crazy? Is there something else wrong? Like, I feel like shit, but the doctor keeps saying everything's normal based on my blood work. So basically what I know and what you've just said is that when we go to have a blood test and we get that blood test back, that segment, that little section that shows the normal range to abnormal range varies day to day based on whoever took the test on that particular day. So whoever's the healthiest of that day is going to set the range of healthy, right? And then whoever's not healthy for that day sets the range of not healthy. Is that how we look at it? Or am I not saying that exactly correctly?
No, you're exactly right. But I think, to kind of further that is just thinking about what else happened when you took that blood work. I mean, a good example is a few years ago, we had a patient with incredibly high cholesterol levels, and it was just shockingly high. I think it was like 500 or 600, in US measurements. Yeah. But when we kind of sat down and, that person, everyone was freaked out. The doctor wanted to prescribe him, anti-cholesterol, statin drugs right away. But we didn't really think of the context. And for him, he always was rushing to the lab in the morning. He was terrified of needles. And so his stress response was always really, really high before getting his cholesterol done. Yep. So we were able to we actually had a whole situation. We sent a nurse to his house, and he had some, his lipids done at a different time in a much more relaxed state. And his cholesterol was actually normal. So things like that are so important. Another good example is I had a patient once who had really high PSA, which is prostate specific antigen. And it was high. It was always normal. And then in, a few measurements in a row, it was high. And no one thought to ask him, maybe if anything changed. They sent him straight for a prostate biopsy. And after that, when that came back normal, we actually found out that he had actually taken up cycling, and he was riding his bike to the lab every morning, and that pressure, in that area from him, that was actually increasing his PSA levels when he got his blood draw. So, all of these factors are so important to you.
Yeah. I also had, back when I worked in a primary care office in the US, they had a patient who they were testing his blood pressure, and it was off the chart. They were ready to call an ambulance. Like, it was massive. And I said, well, why don't I just take him into a room and do some nice, slow, deep breathing and see if we can actually get that blood pressure down. Now, I will tell you, the patient absolutely thought I was talking hocus pocus, magic, hippy dippy doodah, right? He thought I was absolutely whacked out of my ever loving mind. And so the first thing I did was actually explain how breathing can benefit your blood pressure, cholesterol levels, all of these things. And I did some deep breathing with him for about 20 minutes, and his blood pressure dropped right down. And I actually have to say, I had a fan after that. He was a total fan of deep breathing. Which was,
you also saved him from blood pressure meds.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the great thing is in that situation, I was working with medical doctors who absolutely believed in what I was doing, knew that there was research backing it, and was like, this is the best thing to try first, because this is a do no harm approach. Let's see if this works. And then if it doesn't work, then we can move on to calling an ambulance or whatever else we need to do. But, let's give this a try first.
And then just one more topic, or one more thing I want to mention about, when we talk about standard blood work, again, just because we're in the normal range doesn't mean we're healthy, because if we think about what normal range means, it basically just means average. Yeah. And it means average for the area you're in. So, blood or reference ranges for something like, blood sugar, like the cutoff for diabetes, can be a little bit different or can be different in, they're different in the southern US states than they are on the West Coast. And it's not because the criteria for diabetes has changed. It's just because the reference ranges are just basically an average of the population. So, so depending on your age, your sex, your lifestyle factors, just because your blood tests come back as normal, it doesn't mean that that's healthy or optimal for you.
Right. I think that's another excellent point. Would this be a good point for me to kind of share my background and why I reached out to you?
Oh, yeah, it'd be great if you don't mind.
Yeah, not at all. So for you guys that are listening or watching the video, I'm happy to share my personal story. I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of details today, because what I want to do is, again, have Dr. Vanessa back on for us to do a more specialized episode on endometriosis and hormones. But I do want to share with you my experience of chronic fatigue syndrome. Basically, I can't even tell you how far back it started, but what I can say is that it was extremely exacerbated about 6 years ago, when I ended up getting 2 viral infections and a bacterial infection all at the same time. And prior to these infections, I was feeling really fatigued. I was starting to put on a little bit of weight despite exercising all the time, eating a super clean diet. Now, I will say my job was extremely stressful, but other than having a really stressful job, I was very happy in my life. I did yoga, I did all of the right things. We've titled this episode after, right? Like, why the fuck am I so tired when I'm doing everything right? And I'm doing air quotes for those of you who are listening to the podcast rather than watching it. Yeah, got to throw those air quotes in. So I was starting to see some of these symptoms like brain fog and things like that happening. But after I ended up getting these multitude of illnesses all at the same time, oh my God, it changed everything. I went from being a little fatigued to not being able to get out of the bed, not being able to think clearly. I would be in the middle of a session trying to say the word depression, which as a psychologist, we probably say that word a million times a day when we're in session. And I'd be like, like when you're really sleepy and you can't get out of the bed and like you're just not feeling good. And the patient would go, you mean depression? And I'm like, yes, I am a doctor. Depression, that's what I meant. Like, you couldn't find the words. So fatigued, weight gain. Oh my God, I started piling on the weight despite nothing changing from eating healthy and exercising and all of those things. Bloating, massive bloating in my stomach, dizziness, heart palpitations. They kept doing EKGs on me because heart problems run in my family. They kept thinking that maybe it was my heart, but everything showed up normal on that. Shortness of breath. Again, I have to say, in fairness, I was living in Denver, Colorado at the time, which is at altitude. So I was thinking that maybe I was being severely affected by the altitude. But it just, even despite the fact that I was there for 3.5, 4 years, like I never got used to the altitude. Again, I'm doing air quotes, guys. Goodness. So anyway, moving the story forward, I had all kinds of crazy symptoms. And I kept going from doctor to doctor to doctor to doctor, from specialist to specialist, and saying something is very wrong with me. I don't feel like myself. My depression is getting very unmanageable. My anxiety is going up. I'm tired all the time. I'm having all these pains. I can't breathe. And basically, again, what we just talked about, Vanessa, is every single doctor would do my blood work and say, there's absolutely nothing wrong. At this point, I'm doing my own research, right? And trying to figure out what's wrong with me. And I'm going, I'm pretty sure that I have a thyroid issue. Like, I'm hitting every single symptom of a thyroid issue. But every time my blood work came back normal for a thyroid. So again, I'm being told nothing's wrong. Fast forward to moving to New Zealand, and I ended up starting to have extremely severe pain, which again, I will talk about this more later, but turns out I have endometriosis. And with endometriosis comes chronic fatigue, can also come thyroid issues, kind of all of these things that we're talking about today. But I was still told by doctors that there was nothing wrong with me. And after I went through the laparoscopy for the endometriosis, I immediately felt better for about 7 months after the laparoscopy. I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, Vanessa, but like for about 7 months, like my energy, I was almost manic. Like my energy was through the roof. I felt absolutely incredible. Like felt like I just dropped right back down into myself and had all this energy and could think clearly and was happy again. And everything was great. And then at about the 7-month mark, the fatigue started coming back. All of the symptoms started coming back. The pain started coming back. And again, I was told by doctors that there was no way that the endometriosis could have grown back that fast. And there was no reason for my symptoms. So therefore, it must be stress induced. It must be all in my head. Again, I'm doing air quotes for those of you who aren't watching this video. And so then from there, what did I do? I spent thousands of dollars on nutritionists, personal trainers, other naturopaths who didn't happen to be doctor of naturopaths. And so thousands of dollars, and I would start to feel slightly better, but nothing really worked because nobody was addressing inflammation and hormone imbalances, like all these things that Dr. Vanessa is going to talk about today, where she's going to go into a lot more detail. And thank Lord baby Jesus.
Hallelujah.
I found Vanessa, who was like, okay, well, this is what we actually need to target first. And then we'll, go from there. And so again, I know that I said it wasn't going to be a long story and it ended up being a long story, but there's so many more things in there that I want women to know who have endometriosis and who have some of these more chronic illnesses. But I don't want our episode to get too long, so I will go into that in another episode.
Yeah. And just one thing I want to add, Robyn, is a huge pet peeve of mine is when doctors say it in a dismissive fashion, that stress, it's stress induced, and they're implying that, oh, okay, it's all in your head.
Yeah.
But like we know, our stress response deeply affects everything from our thyroid function to our immune system. If we're stressed and having chronically high, cortisol or stress hormones, our immune system is first depressed, and then it gets used to having too much cortisol around, and it flares up, so we get chronic inflammation. So this idea of stress being in your head, it's not. No, stress is deeply entrenched in every single cell of your body. So sorry, throw that in. Big pet peeve of mine.
No, I think that's actually really important to say, because as a patient, that's exactly what it feels like. You go in and they're not talking about a physiological response of stress. They are dismissing you as it is a psychological stress where it's all in your head and you just need to be more resilient, which is a fucking pet peeve of mine when people are told to be more resilient. Which again, I'm not going to go off on a tangent on being resilient, because when you are at your absolute fucking wit's end and it is all you can do to keep breathing and to try to get to work and to try to, just put one foot in front of the other, you are more resilient than anyone could ever imagine. And so to be told that you need to buck up, be more resilient, go to see a psychologist, which again, obviously I'm a psychologist and I am absolutely love to support people through this process, but it's not because they need a psychologist because they're crazy. It's because it's nice to have that support of the psychologist saying, you are extremely resilient. And, these are the ways in which I can support you through your journey. And it's not about making you feel like it's all in your head.
Absolutely. Back to that as well, like being all in our head versus, in our body, and just the interplay between both of those, being in chronic pain, having chronic fatigue, having latent viral infection, having, some kind of toxicity in your body, that actually drives a stress response. It actually turns on the chemistry of stress, which then has further, impacts on inflammation, again, on immune system function, on hormone balance and everything. So it's so intertwined and so frustrating. And, if a doctor ever does say, stress is all in your head, even if they were being dismissive, realize that, it's absolutely not. It's in your entire body.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. I think that's important, an important message for us to just keep repeating. So I think this would be a good time for us to start to go into a little bit more of the specific details. But before we do that, I think we'll start with what is fatigue. And Vanessa, I know you're going to go into actually explaining the physiological, what that means physiologically. But I just want to kind of throw in here real quick. Fatigue is not the same as tiredness. I think that is a really important distinction, because there's nothing that pisses someone off with chronic fatigue more than for you to be like, well, I didn't get much sleep last night either, and I'm tired, right? Like, that's tiredness is something that goes away when you get more sleep. Fatigue is something that no matter how much sleep you get, you still barely have enough energy to even take a shower. And it is an ongoing feeling over and over and over again for multiple days, weeks, months at a time. You just can't recover after a good night's sleep. So I just wanted to make sure that I stated that for people who are listening to this that may not have experienced chronic fatigue, and that's fantastic. And I hope you never do. But if you know someone or you're trying to support someone with chronic fatigue, that's the best way I can kind of describe the difference, is even taking a shower feels impossible.
Yeah, and that's such a great distinction, and kind of it leads into kind of cellularly what's going on, because this idea of fatigue is, we talk about it from a kind of physiological point of view. It's to do with the cell's energy production machinery and mechanisms not really working, and when that breaks down, the cell can't even do its basic function. So if that's a muscle cell, it may not be able to pump out lactic acid, and so results in the symptoms of soreness. Or if it's a brain cell, it might not be able to generate the energy to kind of do neurotransmission or to talk to other brain cells, and so we can't think of words, or we get depressed. And so that's so important that you mentioned, it's not just being tired, like we may feel if we just don't get a good night's sleep.
Yeah. So the cells are like your little minions, is what you're saying, right? And if your little minions are not working, if they don't have the energy, or there's something getting in their way, they're not able to produce the way that we need them to produce, correct?
Exactly. So each of our cells, we have these tiny structures called mitochondria, and there can be hundreds up to hundreds of thousands of mitochondria per cell, depending on the type of cell. So cells that require more energy, or that have a higher energy demand, like say a brain cell or a cardiac cell, a heart cell, they're going to have much more of these structures called mitochondria in them. And so what mitochondria are, they're basically your cell's little mini power stations. So they're the little guys that take, the sugars or sometimes the fatty acids from the food we eat and break down, and they take that and they shuffle it around, and they move electrons around, and they basically produce energy, or they produce the body's energy currency, which is called, ATP, from the fuel that we put in the form of the food we eat, or the fat that maybe we're breaking down. And so these little power stations, these mitochondria in our cells, they're affected by many different things, and they're dependent on, many nutrients for, the process of energy production to occur. And they can be damaged very easily by things like chronic inflammation, by things like heavy metals. And so as these mitochondria, they produce energy. If for some reason their ability to produce energy kind of breaks down or decreases, then that's the point at which the cell doesn't have enough energy to do what it's supposed to do. And that's where, over time we'll start to develop clinical symptoms depending on, what cell type are more affected.
Okay. So would we say, because I always like to do imagery, my patients know I love to do imagery, and the more fun, the better, because that's how I learn. And I know a lot of people learn that way. So would you say then the mitochondria are like the Pacman? Like that they're there to kind of eat the energy and then transfer it to a different station. But if the energy's not there, they've got nothing to eat to kind of transfer it. Is that a way of thinking about it?
It's definitely a good way. They take the breakdown, all the food and the sugar and the carbohydrates and the fats we eat, be broken down into simple sugars that the mitochondria use, and they basically take those fuels and they turn it into chemical energy.
Correct. So they would be eating the sugar, and then they'd be, for lack of a better way of saying it, pooping it out into energy.
Basically, yeah.
But
basically, yeah.
If there's something wrong, then either they're, eating it and not pooping it back out, or they're not eating it at all, and then you've got excess sugar or excess things. Is that a way of looking at it as well?
Yeah, that's definitely one way. You could definitely look at it like that. That's very colorful.
Is that an okay way of looking at it, or am I totally making this shit up as I go?
No, I like it.
Okay, you can totally correct me and be like, Robyn, that's not the appropriate medical way of looking at it.
I don't know if that's the way we learn in school, but
right.
It's very colorful. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll take colorful. Okay, I will stop interrupting you and let you. What else would you like to say about kind of what gets in the way of those little Pacman? Like, what kind of influences? You started to mention toxicity and inflammation. I don't know if you want to go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess probably the first thing to start with is just the idea of nutrient deficiencies, because so basically the steps in which the mitochondria take their fuel and turn it into energy require different enzymes, and these enzymes are just often different proteins that take one substance and turn it into another, and all of these enzymes require something called cofactors, and these cofactors are often in the form of minerals and vitamins. So if we're chronically deficient in certain nutrients, that's where our cellular machinery that generates energy doesn't work well. And again, different people will have different energy requirements, and so again, looking at something like iron levels and saying just because you're in range, for a lot of women, below 40 or even 80, of ferritin, that's just not enough iron to really kind of help to generate that energy production. So the first thing to think about is, I think, nutrient deficiencies.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, because that was something that we came across when we were doing my lab work. And when I say we, I mean me and you, is that my understanding is that, again, iron is, you've got the iron, but the ferritin is what carries the iron into the bloodstream. Is that correct?
The ferritin, the ferritin is actually the storage form of iron. So it's a good marker of yeah.
Okay.
But interestingly, ferritin is also what we call an acute phase inflammatory protein, or so often, sometimes if we're really inflamed, we may see our ferritin very high. And that can mislead us. So we could think, oh, we have enough iron for energy production, when it's actually just because we're inflamed that iron is so high. So
can you have
ferritin?
Can you have an iron level that looks normal, but a ferritin level that doesn't look normal? Or are they both? Would they both be the same?
No, so we can look at total blood iron, and that's the amount of iron that's actually in the bloodstream. But your body doesn't like to have too much iron in the bloodstream, because iron is basically causes oxidative stress. It can cause, for lack of better terminology, rusting, and it stresses the antioxidant capacity of our body. So our body doesn't like to have free iron running around, and we'll usually, the iron in the bloodstream will usually be reflective of, what people have eaten throughout the day, versus the ferritin is how much of that iron has kind of been stored in the body. And there's also another marker called transferritin, and that's our transport form of iron. So that's the little boat that basically takes iron from one cell to another. So people will usually look at, basically transferritin saturation, which is how many little molecules of iron are traveling on each little boat as it's kind of moving around from cell to cell. Our ferritin, which is our stored iron, and also sometimes they'll look at, blood iron as well. Another interesting point, though, is it's not just our cells that like iron. A lot of bacteria like iron as well. So if we have an infection, our body will actually sequester iron. So it'll pull iron out of the bloodstream to keep it away from bacteria. So if you're acutely sick, especially with a bacterial infection, sometimes people will actually look somewhat anemic. And it's really important not to give people iron when they are sick or have a bacterial infection, because that could also feed the, bacterial metabolism.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'd never heard that before. The reason I was asking about the difference in the ferritin is because I feel like before I found you and I was going through all of the lab work, from different GP to different GP, they kept telling me that my iron was normal, but it wasn't until I did the blood work with you where you said, well, we need to look at ferritin. And so I feel like the GPs either didn't look at the ferritin, or again, they were still putting me in a normal category. So I guess that's why my question was, can you have, quote unquote, keeping in mind what we talked about earlier about our lab levels, can you have a seemingly normal iron that then the GP doesn't even bother to look at the ferritin?
Yeah, the frustrating, most GPs in fairness will look at ferritin, but the frustrating thing is, the normal range for ferritin in most, or for us, is, between 20 and 300. And that's a big ass range.
Yeah.
If you're 21 or 22 or, even 30, that could be normal. And someone, without taking your entire case could say, oh yeah, that's normal, kind of send you on your way. Like, you're not frankly, iron deficient based on that. But at the same time, for most women, an iron level of below 60 or 80, usually, that won't be enough iron to really help produce energy, because our mitochondria, one of the enzymes that shuffles, one of the electrons to another spot to help produce energy, the enzyme needs iron as a cofactor. So if we don't have enough iron for that, we'll usually, energy production will be low without actually seeing, red blood cells being low.
And
so
I've read, and you tell me if you've also come across this, Vanessa, but since moving to New Zealand, I've done quite a bit of research on vitamin deficiencies, because I seem to have had more deficiencies after moving to New Zealand than I had in the US. And now, in fairness, I just want to put out there that I am vegetarian, mostly vegan. So I'm very well aware of my B12 levels and things like that. But I actually wasn't having any problems with my iron levels, or that I knew of, having any problems with my iron levels in the US. And so I did some research on it. And what I read was that in New Zealand, there is a lot of issue with iron deficiency because the soil doesn't contain iron here. And so therefore you almost have to get it from some sort of external source, because that's actually how we get our nutrients, is usually from the soil of the food that we eat, not necessarily from the animal that we eat or the plants that we eat, but it comes from the soil. Anyway, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. That's a whole nother episode on nutrients and stuff. But have you come across that as well? Does it sound accurate that would be part of why so many people may be iron deficient?
I know selenium is a big deficiency in the soil in New Zealand, and that's definitely one of the reasons a lot of people are selenium deficient. Iron, haven't seen that as much, but I mean, the other big thing in New Zealand is people drink coffee and tea all day long, and I do too sometimes. And tannins in coffee and tea, they actually can interfere with iron absorption. So, I mean, that could potentially be another factor as well.
Okay. And I know that we also wanted to make sure that we mentioned vitamin D here as well, because that's, while most people know about iron, about vitamin D, about B12, I think that, again, oftentimes you go to a GP or a primary care doctor and you say, I'm feeling a bit fatigued. I'd like my iron checked. I'd like my B12 checked, and I'd like my vitamin D checked. And again, we've already learned that it can come back normal and not be normal. But what are some other things that are important to keep in mind with like a vitamin D deficiency, for example?
Actually, before we go to vitamin D, there's two more things I want to mention about B12. Okay. And the one is, so the B12 measurement that we normally do in the lab, it is a measurement of B12 in the body, but it doesn't always kind of tell us. It can sometimes also pick up something called B12 analogs. So these are things that look like B12, our cells don't actually use them as B12. So, people can still be B12 deficient, even if the B12 is normal. For me, I like to see B12 not just in range, but over 300 is a good kind of marker to look at. And the other thing is, especially if you're vegan, looking at a marker called methylmalonic acid that's a better B12 test than just the serum B12, definitely.
And is that the the MTHR, FR? All I know is that people call it the motherfucker. Yeah. Is that what you're talking? The methyl something? Blah, blah, blah.
Similar. It's just a marker of B12, of B12 levels, and it's much more accurate than testing serum B12. So if you're a vegan, asking your doctor to do a measurement called methylmalonic acid is usually a better indicator.
Say that slower so that our listeners can try and write that down or get that. What would be good for them to ask their GP to test?
The marker called methylmalonic acid, MMA.
Okay. Methylmalonic acid, MMA.
And there's a really good marker to determine if you have B12 deficiency. And just the last thing I'll say, because everyone thinks of vegans as being B12 deficient, but it's actually, in my practice, the people who have the biggest B12 deficiencies are people that don't produce enough stomach acid, and that's usually people as you get older. So B12, in order to liberate it from food, it takes a lot of stomach acid and a lot of it's a lot of work for your body. So as we get older, if we are drinking a lot of coffee and teas, if we're not digesting our food properly, a lot of people with chronic gut issues have B12 deficiency more so than vegans, who I find know to supplement B12.
Interesting. So going back to vitamin D for a second, would you like to elaborate on the vitamin D?
Yeah, so vitamin D, while it's not necessarily associated with energy production, vitamin D is so crucial for immune system function. And if our vitamin D levels are abnormal, then we're much more prone to developing autoimmunity, chronic inflammation, potentially even certain cancers. So this idea of chronic fatigue and vitamin D is so important. And it's so important to obviously to get out in the sun, but it's quite frustrating when doctors don't want to test vitamin D, because there's so much research showing that vitamin D in a certain range, not just in the normal range, is beneficial for mood, for cognition, like I said, for immune system, for cancer, even for cardiometabolic disease, so heart disease risk, and also diabetes is vitamin D is crucial. And so even if often vitamin D in New Zealand isn't subsidized, because the assumption is that everyone in New Zealand will be vitamin D deficient, and I think that's something we need to get our heads around, because I think the assumption is that, oh, the sun is shining, I'm outside, I'm going to get vitamin D, but unfortunately, we can only actually make vitamin D when the UVA rays coming down from the sun are at a certain angle to our skin. And because we're so far south, because of our latitude, this actually doesn't happen for a lot of the year in some places. Like, when I was living in Christchurch, even though the sun was shining half the year, you actually weren't making, vitamin D other than a few hours a day at all over there. So first of all, definitely get your vitamin D level tested. We want to, ideally for immune system function, the research shows that we want to be probably above 80, and that's a good target to shoot for vitamin D. And also, I think it's also important to mention that, while vitamin D supplementation is useful, and we don't want to be vitamin D deficient, and we want to kind of get our levels up, vitamin D supplementation is not a substitute for getting, adequate and, safe sun exposure. There's so many other benefits to sun exposure, from making nitric oxide when it hits our skin, which causes dilation of blood vessels, it drops our blood pressure, it makes serotonin and happy hormones, happy neurotransmitters.
We got to mention the psychology. We're on the psychology podcast. Yeah.
Go outside in the morning, we'll make serotonin, we'll feel good, we'll feel happy. That strong midday sun helps to drive dopamine, and when that sun goes away, when we look at the sunset, that serotonin is now made into melatonin, and melatonin is one of the crucial, or hormones for sleep and also for immune system function overnight. Because if we don't get a melatonin spike at night, which is dependent on, the light during the day, then, our immune system at night doesn't increase its surveillance, especially against viruses and cancer cells. So, we love the sun. Sun is so important. One more little, caveat, or one more little aside against this about the sun is, the sun energy also helps to increase mitochondrial energy production. So being out in the sun can actually give you energy, because that sunlight, just the energy of the sun and that can actually help increase the efficiency through which your body produces chemical energy. So we love the sun.
Yeah. And I just want to point out here but what you said about the sun, the sun needing to be at a certain angle, the UVs needing to come through. And in particular, those of us living in New Zealand, again, this goes back to why you may be doing everything right, but you're still feeling fatigued and you're not getting all of those benefits. And it's not your fault. We can't help the position of the sun and like where we live. But I've been told that by GPs here in New Zealand. And again, I haven't been in the US. I haven't lived in the US in about 5 years now. And so I can't remember if vitamin D is something that is run pretty regularly. I believe it is when you have your labs done, which is usually covered by insurance. So I don't know that Americans have the same issue with having to ask for vitamin D being run. Whereas what Vanessa was saying in New Zealand is that it's not part of our panel anymore because we actually have to pay out of pocket for it here in New Zealand, whereas our other blood work is covered under our, I don't know if you call it social medicine, but under our medicine that we have here. And so that's something that I've had to put my foot down and say, I am willing to pay out of pocket. I very much want my vitamin D levels run.
Yeah. And so, it's definitely worth doing, at least, I would say at least once a year. If you live, even further south in the North Island. So if you live in the South Island, even more crucial. There's another really cool resource I want to mention. There's a free app called DMinder, D-M-I-N-D-E-R, DMinder. It takes your GPS location and it lets you know when the sun is at the right angle during the day for you to produce vitamin D. Awesome. And it's a really cool tool where you can kind of get a sense of throughout the year, just how much of the day you'll actually produce vitamin D. And when the sun is at the right angle, you can click, you can do start sun session. And, before you use the app, it looks at your Fitzpatrick skin tone, and it kind of makes an assessment about how long it would be safe for you to be in the sun. And then you can also put in your vitamin D blood measurement. And if you use it every day and you're really kind of
diligent,
diligent, then and basically it can track and it'll estimate, your vitamin D blood levels as you use the app. And it'll tell you, like, as when you're in the sun and you're using the app, how much your vitamin D production. So like, I was outside this morning and I was using my DMinder and I made, 20,000 IUs of vitamin D, and you can kind of watch the little dial go around. It's a really amazing, a very, very cool tool. So I highly recommend that one.
Oh, that's super cool. We like our free apps.
Yeah. DMinder.
Yeah, cool. And another nutrient that you mentioned was iodine, or iodine if you're in the US.
Yeah, so iodine is so important, and it's another really big, a very common nutrient deficiency we see in New Zealand. And obviously iodine is present in seafood, and so vegetarians, vegans, people who are not consuming seafood, or because our diets generally don't include sea vegetables like our seaweeds. Sorry, my dad was, my parents were macrobiotic, which is a Japanese way of eating. And we had a lot of seaweed. My dad's a doctor. He's so into seaweed. Yeah. He used to say, don't call it seaweed. It's a sea vegetable. Be respectful. So well, that in great.
I just have to say, on a side note, I have tried so hard to like seaweed, sea vegetable for your dad out there. And I cannot like it. I fucking hate it. It's like licking, and I love the ocean, but to me it's like licking the bottom of the ocean. I just cannot do it. So I am probably very deficient in iodine.
I mean, if we get frank deficiency of iodine, to the point where it's clinically manifested, it's something called goiter. So we get the swelling in our neck.
Okay.
And that's pretty much been reduced or eliminated with the advent or with the incorporation of iodized table salt in New Zealand. But for many people, or, a lot of health conscious people, they're not using iodized sea salt. So, kelp and sea veggies are so important. But, a lot of us, we don't get enough iodine from, iodized sea salt. And this can matter.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just want to say real quick, because that was something I didn't know until I saw a nutritionist. Sea salt doesn't automatically have iodine in it. You have to get sea salt that has that in it, right? So it should be on the label, iodized sea salt or iodized table salts or what have you, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Or like I said, get the sea veggies in.
Yeah.
I love a little bit of kelp in your diet.
Yeah.
But iodine is so important for thyroid function. And I think we're going to probably do lots of episodes on hormones later on. but our thyroid is basically the little gland that produces the hormones that set our metabolic rate. So basically the hormones that tell our cells how much energy to produce. And if we don't have enough thyroid hormones because we're deficient in iodine, then those little power stations don't make enough energy. So, if we're iodine deficient, then that'll also deeply impact our thyroid function. And thyroid function is so important for in chronic fatigue as well. Oh, and the last thing I want to say, iodine is so crucial for women's health. So breast health is often tied to iodine and iodine deficiency. So if we don't have enough iodine, we tend to produce too much, or we tend to not be able to get rid of estrogen, and we have high estrogen levels. And a really common symptom of iodine deficiency is, issues with a fibrocystic breast or kind of lumpy breasts, or, estrogen dominance. So.
Yeah. And I think that's really important, because especially nowadays, and again, we're going to do probably multiple episodes on hormones and women's health, but nowadays we have, I think, probably at unheard of rates of high estrogen levels in women due to various reasons, things like perfumes and makeup and all of this stuff that is impacting our body's ability to get rid of that excess estrogen. And also, isn't there quite a bit of research that ties higher estrogen levels into higher cancer rates for women? Is that correct?
Absolutely, especially obviously with breast cancer.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but that's interesting. I knew about the excess estrogen, but I didn't know how iodine played into that. So I think that's a really interesting takeaway for women or men who are listening to this, to chat with your females in your life, about iodine, because it's really simple. It's a simple, just purchasing iodized salt or eating your sea vegetables, that's an easy thing to incorporate.
One of my favorite ways to incorporate, an iodine-rich food into our diet is you can often find like kelp sprinkles at the grocery store, and these are a great source, obviously, of iodine, but also of selenium often, and those are two nutrient deficiencies we see commonly in New Zealand. So, if you don't mind the taste, I know someone here doesn't like them. I love them. Replacing your table salt, at least a couple times a week with some kelp sprinkles.
Yeah, it's not working for me, Vanessa. The salt is not working for me. I want so badly to be the good vegan, good vegetarian that's like chomping on seaweed, but just not going to happen. So I have to work with you to get mine elsewhere.
You can also get a liquid iodine in other forms as well. But I guess the one caveat to mention is, some people, especially if you have hyperthyroid or different autoimmune thyroid conditions, you can be very sensitive to iodine. So, I definitely don't recommend taking, high dose iodine or high dose iodine supplementation or the kelp tablets. That's something you want to look at your thyroid function first to determine if that's right for you. But, for the vast majority, 95% of people, incorporating iodine in your food in the form of a little bit of seaweed a couple times a week is a really good idea.
Yeah, I think that is important to say, that when we're talking about which we really haven't talked a whole lot about supplementation, but obviously we're talking about that at the moment, this is why we're saying it's very important to work alongside your doctor of naturopath and your GP to have the blood work run, because you definitely don't want to overdose on iodine. And some of these you can't overdose on, you'll just pee them out. And then others you can, and iodine is one of those that, again, it's not frequent and it's not, it's pretty rare that this would happen, but it is something just to consider. Also, when we say, notice that Vanessa's saying a couple times a week, she's not saying pour it all over your food.
Not like every meal.
So someone, I just want to make sure I say that. So someone's like, I heard a podcast that I love salt, so I could just take this salt and salt everything all over my food, because that gave me permission to use salt.
Sea veggies, yeah. And the last thing about sea veggies, they should be kind of part of our diet, but also you got to keep in mind source, because sea vegetables, they tend to bioaccumulate heavy metals and also potential radioactive material. Probably keeping to New Zealand based sea vegetable sources. So, Pacific Harvest is a New Zealand company. They make a lot of really clean seaweeds, but I would be just a little careful about, using dried seaweeds and stuff from countries that may not be as clean.
Okay. So if they're in the US, looking at where the seaweed is coming from would be important. And it also, I would imagine, organic. Would that be something that you would want to have, or does that not really give enough details?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of sea veggies, they are kind of cultivated domestically, but most of them are still wild harvested. So usually you wouldn't see organic as a label, probably as much, unless they were grown, kind of cultivated.
Okay. Okay. We've talked about vitamin D. We've talked about iodine. We've talked about your mitochondria. We talked about kind of all of this stuff. What else would be things for us to consider that may be impacting or kind of feeding chronic fatigue syndrome?
Well, back, in terms of nutrient deficiencies, I wouldn't say these kind of perpetuate chronic fatigue. They're not a cause necessarily, but, another really, really important nutrient that we should definitely mention, we talked about the vitamins and then iodine, kind of moving to the minerals, but another really important one for chronic fatigue that I see deficient in a lot of people is magnesium. So magnesium is so important. Without enough magnesium, we don't have proper energy production, and then without enough magnesium, our body can't relax deep enough. So we kind of had this. Often people kind of present with, fatigue, but be kind of tired but wired kind of feeling.
Absolutely. And I used to, when I worked with, specifically worked with chronic pain patients, I talked about magnesium all of the time because it's so important for muscle spasms. If you're having a lot of muscle spasms, magnesium can be of significant benefit. Also mood. Like if you're deficient in magnesium, you're not going to be in a very good mood either. And so, but what I do want to ask you about, which was, I didn't quite know as much about as I know now, is that there's different types of magnesium. And so is there a particular type, or would you recommend different types depending on what people's symptoms are?
Yeah, well, when it comes down to magnesium, obviously magnesium is it's a mineral, and it's an electrolyte in our body. So, it helps us, with muscle contraction, with neurotransmissions and nerves talking to each other, with mood, with everything else. But magnesium in terms of the form is going to be I definitely see it as dependent on what's going on. Okay. So magnesium generally comes chelated, so it comes stuck to different things, and they're usually comes stuck to different amino acids. Before we get into the different types, the one type of magnesium I would say you probably don't want to be taking. It's the cheapest form, and it acts as a great laxative, but it's not that well absorbed. It's magnesium oxide. Okay. So a lot of your, inexpensive, grocery store supplements will use magnesium oxide as a form. And, if you think about what oxide is a free radical. It causes oxidative stress. So, it's not the best form. Like I said, you can use magnesium oxide in large amounts as a laxative or bowel prep. So it will help you go to the toilet because magnesium oxide is so poorly absorbed that it stays in the gut. And when it's in the gut, magnesium pulls more water into the gut, and that causes kind of diarrhea or loosening of the stools. But in terms of what the good forms are, generally, again, it depends on what's going on. In terms of muscle relaxation, I really like magnesium glycinate. Glycine or bisglycinate. Glycine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It also has an additional calming effect, in addition to the calming effect of magnesium. So it's a great one for muscle pain, for sleep. Magnesium malate is a really great form for muscle pain, because malic acid is another something else that helps with muscle function. For cardiovascular health, there's a form called magnesium taurate, which is bound to taurine. Taurine is another amino acid that the heart uses for contraction. So that's kind of double use for the heart. What are the magnesium? There's a really interesting form they're using a lot in psychiatry or mood disorders called magnesium threonate. I don't know if you've come across that one. Yep. Yeah. And that's a really form because it goes straight into the brain and crosses the blood-brain barrier really easily. So
I don't know if that one's as easy to find right now, though. I'm not sure how easy is that one to find.
It's not generally easy to find in like health or over the counter. I mean, not health food stores, but like grocery stores or pharmacies. But really good health food stores will have it. Naturopaths or naturopathic doctors will often have it. Okay. Integrative-minded GPs will kind of know where to find it. Yeah. That's the form. I mean, the other, another form that's not bad and it's really widely available, if you're on a budget, magnesium citrate. It's not terrible. that works pretty well, generally, and that's probably the lowest cost. And then, if we're talking about kind of, just getting your magnesium levels up quickly, I really love magnesium sulfate too, which is Epsom salts. Having a bath with 2 cups of Epsom salts, especially if you don't like taking supplements a few times a week, will really replenish your magnesium levels quite well.
Absolutely. What about, because I've even seen now, lotions with magnesium in them.
Yeah.
Obviously, we want to be careful that we're not getting a lotion that's full of toxins, like fragrances and things like that. But if we're going natural, like a natural lotion with magnesium, that would be another way of getting it as well, correct?
Yeah, so usually the transdermal forms are magnesium chloride. So it's basically almost like concentrated seawater kind of minerals.
Yeah.
Basically. So that works quite well. I can't tolerate it. I find it really itchy. I
do
like magnesium gel, but people do.
I'm the same way. I cannot do the lotion. It makes me itch until I almost scratch until I bleed. I cannot take it. So back in the US, there was a supplement that I used to like that you could drink, and it had a nice flavor. It was like a lemonade flavor, and you'd get it at Whole Foods or any kind of grocery stores that were a bit more organic, and it was called Calm.
I remember Calm.
Yeah, it was fantastic for anxiety, as well as when I was healing from a torn ACL and I was having muscle spasms after the surgery. The medication they gave me did nothing. I took that magnesium and I had no more muscle spasms. Like, it was unbelievable. I'm not sure what type of magnesium Calm has in it, but that's another thing. If you're in the US, another version rather than putting the lotion on, or if you're like me and you've moved into a really nice place, but it doesn't have a bathtub anymore, which makes me very sad. I can't take my baths anymore. That's another way of possibly getting your magnesium.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point. And I think the next one we're going to talk about is gut function. So a lot of times, especially, I don't want to pick on grocery store and pharmacies, but the magnesium tablets are these hard, big tablets. Unless you have a lot of stomach acid and you're in a relaxed state, you may not be breaking those down enough to absorb the magnesium. So that's why, the Calm, I think it is magnesium citrate. It's like an effervescent lemon fiber powder.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's actually quite a good form, because it's, when you mix it with water, it liberates magnesium and you can kind of absorb it very easily. So yeah, I'm a big fan of this.
And I think that's another important point, kind of going back to doing everything right and it not fucking working, is if you're already taking magnesium and you're taking a supplement and it doesn't feel like it's benefiting you, it could be that maybe it has to do with your stomach acid and you're not able to absorb it. Or I forget the other point I was going to make, or maybe it's not the type of magnesium. Maybe look at it and see if it was one of those that you were like, it's not necessarily, the most helpful. Maybe consider changing the way that you're getting the magnesium.
Yeah, definitely. And, that's another point. Just want to make, almost like the reference ranges. Just because you're taking something doesn't mean you're absorbing it. Yeah. And full disclosure, we often like to pick on the pharmaceutical industry, but, the supplement industry as well has a lot of problems. And I'm not knocking anyone. I hope my mom doesn't hear this, but I grew up, my mom had the GNC franchise in the Bahamas when we grew up. And, I love
GNC. I used to spend a lot of money at GNC.
But they do have a lot of products that I wouldn't recommend. So, a lot of, coal tar derived, B complex vitamins, and, and not just vitamin C, CVS and all these kind of, retail companies. And so oftentimes, just because we're taking something doesn't mean, one, they're in the right form for our body to absorb and utilize, or for our body to utilize, and two, that, we might not even be absorbing them. So
yeah,
it's really important, not to write off, a supplement because you've tried it, but working with someone who understands form and dosing. Dose is a big one as well. So many people come to me, oh, I take this and I take this, but I'm just like, they're taking a fraction of what they actually need, and so they're not seeing the benefit, and so they're writing off all all supplements just because of that.
Yeah, exactly. All right, lovelies, I hope you have enjoyed this episode so far. As mentioned previously, we will be back with more amazing information related to chronic fatigue. In the meantime, if you're living in New Zealand or Australia and think I might be a good fit for you as a psychologist, please email me at notafloatinghead@gmail.com. Also, if you have questions or topics you'd like to be discussed, you can also email me at notafloatinghead@gmail.com. For funny, informative videos and pics, you can follow me on Instagram at NotAFloatingHead. If you're living in New Zealand or Australia and would like to reach out to Dr. Vanessa about a consultation, you can go to her website, which I'll also include in the show notes. But her website is n=1.life. So that's the number 1 for those of you that are listening and not watching. So her website is n=1.life. Thanks for listening, and until next time, go have an adventure.